Let go of the child, and I'll make sure the ambulance gets here before you bleed out.
The mansion of Yoon Sung-hyun was a cathedral of glass, cold stone, and whispered violence. To the men in tailored suits who paced its perimeter, the world was a map of vulnerabilities and power plays. But to Kim Antonio, it was simply a place that required a light touch and a steady schedule. She moved through the high-ceilinged halls like a ghost in sensible flats, her presence so meticulously curated to be dull that the guard's eyes slid right over her. She was the base shadow, a woman whose most radical act was ensuring the crusts were cut perfectly off a peanut butter sandwich. In the nursery, the air was different, softer, smelling of lavender detergent and wooden blocks. 8-year-old Dae-sik sat on the floor, her wavy dark hair falling over a coloring book. She was a child born into a fortress, a girl who knew her father was a king, but didn't understand he ruled with a scepter of iron and blood. When Antonio entered, the girl's face transformed, the tension in her small shoulders melting away. "You're late by 2 minutes, Tony," Dae-sik chirped, using the nickname Antonio had allowed only her to use. "The tea had a steep, little bird," Antonio replied, her voice a calm, melodic contrast to the gravelly shouts of the men downstairs. She knelt beside the girl, her posture perfect, her movements economical. She didn't just watch Dae-sik. She observed the perimeter of the room, her internal radar constantly pinging against the windows and the heavy oak door. It was a reflex she couldn't kill, no matter how many layers of domesticity she draped over her past. Later that evening, as the rain began to drum against the reinforced glass, Antonio brushed Dae-sik's hair. Each stroke was rhythmic, grounding. In the mirror's reflection, Antonio saw a woman with a neutral lip and a disciplined jaw, the face of a servant. But behind those dark eyes, she was calculating the exit routes of the mansion for the 1,000th time. Sung-hyun passed the doorway then, a silhouette of sharp lapels and brooding intensity. He paused, his furrowed brow softening for a fraction of a second as he watched his daughter laugh at something Antonio whispered. He saw a nanny who was reliable, quiet, and profoundly unimportant. He didn't see the way Antonio's grip on the hairbrush shifted instinctively into a striking position the moment his shadow hit the rug. "She needs to sleep soon, Nanny Kim," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Of course, Mr. Yoon," Antonio replied, bowing her head just enough to hide the spark of clinical assessment in her eyes. She waited until he was gone before she let out a breath. She loved this girl with a fierce, protective ache that terrified her. It was the only crack in her armor, the only thing that made her human again. She tucked Dae-sik into bed, smoothing the white sheets, unaware that within hours, the silence she had fought so hard to maintain would be torn apart by the sound of shattering glass and the metallic tang of gunpowder. The transition from a sanctuary of a nursery to the jagged edges of the Chicago streets happened in the span of a heartbeat. The rain had intensified, falling in heavy, translucent sheets that blurred the neon signs of the city into bleeding smears of red and blue. Kim Antonio sat in the rear of the armored SUV, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression a mask of professional boredom. Beside her, Dae-sik was humming a soft tune, kicking her legs against the leather seat, oblivious to the way the traffic had begun to funnel into a suspicious, narrow choke point. "The driver is taking the lower bridge route," Antonio noted internally. Her pulse didn't quicken, it flattened. The first impact was a dull, heavy thud, a blacked-out delivery truck losing control and T-boning their lead escort vehicle. Then came the screech of tires as a second van swerved to block their path. Before the security detail could even reach for their radios, the night air was punctured by the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of suppressed gunfire. Inside the SUV, the driver slumped forward, the glass spiderwebbing but holding. Dae-sik screamed, a high, piercing sound that cut through the silence of the cabin. In that instant, the nanny vanished. Kim Antonio's spine straightened with a sickeningly fluid grace. Her eyes, once soft and motherly, became cold, calculating lenses. "Day sick, Floor. Now," she commanded. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a frequency that demanded absolute obedience. As the rear door was wrenched open by a man in tactical gear, a professional operative moving with high-speed precision, Antonio didn't recoil. She surged forward. In her right hand was the heavy metal fountain pen she'd used to check off grocery lists that morning. With a single, explosive movement, she jammed the nib into the attacker's brachial plexus, a strike so accurate it paralyzed his arm instantly. She stepped out into the deluge, her beige blouse soaking through, turning translucent against her skin. Another man lunged, reaching for the girl in the back seat. Antonio didn't use a flashy move. She used physics. She caught his wrist, twisted, and used his own momentum to drive his face into the door frame. The sound of breaking bone was wet and final. Behind her, the roar of a luxury engine heralded the arrival of Yoon Sung-hyun's secondary team. But as the Mafia boss stepped out of his car, his gun drawn and his face twisted in a snarl of fatherly rage, he stopped. He didn't see a victim. He saw his daughter's nanny standing over two unconscious, highly trained mercenaries. A small cut on her forehead dripped crimson down her pale cheek, but her hand was steady as she reached back into the car to shield Day 6's eyes. She looked at the most powerful man in Chicago not with fear, but with the weary, lethal authority of a predator who had finally been forced to stop playing pretend. The switch had flipped. There was no turning it back. The 3 seconds that followed were a blur of clinical precision and cold efficiency. Antonio moved like water, fluid and unstoppable. The third operative stepped into the rain, his suppressed rifle coming up to level at her chest. He was fast, but Antonio had already calculated his trajectory. She closed the distance before he could find his trigger pull, her palm slamming into the base of his nose with a sickening crunch. As he reclined into the asphalt, she stripped the sidearm from his holster, her thumbs checking the safety by muscle memory alone. A fourth man appeared from the shadows of the secondary van, lunging not for Antonio, but for the open door of the SUV. "Day 6, Antonio's voice cracked the air, but it was too late. The operative was a specialist. He didn't engage Antonio. He deployed a flashbang that detonated in a white-hot roar of magnesium and thunder. The world turned to salt and static. Through the ringing in her ears and the blurred edges of her vision, Antonio saw the silhouette of the man hoisting the small, white-clad figure of Day 6 into the back of a black sedan. The tires screamed against the wet pavement, kicking up a spray of oily mist as the vehicle fishtailed away, disappearing into the labyrinth of the industrial district. Antonio didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She stood in the center of the intersection, the rain washing the blood from her knuckles, her eyes tracking the fading red glow of the sedan's taillights. She was memorizing the license plate, the tread pattern, the exact timing of the traffic lights. A fleet of black luxury cars screeched to a halt around her, their headlights cutting through the gloom like the eyes of predators. Doors slammed. A dozen men in sharp, dark suits flooded the street, guns drawn, their faces masks of disciplined aggression. At their center was Yoon Sung-hyun. He didn't look like a father. He looked like a god of war. His tailored coat was drenched, his hair plastered to his forehead, his eyes wild with a terror he was trying to choke into submission. He sprinted toward the empty SUV, then stopped dead. His gaze fell on the 3 men sprawled on the ground around his daughter's nanny. One was clutching a shattered throat. Another had a fountain pen buried in his shoulder. The third lay motionless with his nose driven into his brain. Sung-hyun looked at the bodies, then at Antonio. She was standing perfectly still, the stolen handgun held in a professional low-ready position. The base shadow was gone. The woman before him had a smear of blood across her brow and a gaze so icy it made the Chicago winter feel warm. "Where is she?" Sung Hyun rasped, his voice breaking. Antonio didn't blink. "They have her. We have 4 minutes before they reach the safe house transition. Get in the car, Mr. Yoon. I'm driving." The interior of the luxury sedan tasted of expensive leather and ozone. Yoon Sung Hyun didn't sit. He loomed, his body a coiled spring of lethal desperation. He grabbed Antonio by the lapel of her damp beige blouse, slamming her back against the door. The move was designed to shatter a normal person's resolve, to elicit tears or a frantic confession. "Who are you?" Sung Hyun's voice was a low, vibrating snarl, his face inches from hers. "You know Nanny. You stood in the middle of a kill zone and didn't even flinch. Did you set this up? Was my daughter the prize for your cover?" Antonio didn't struggle. She didn't even raise her hands to defend herself. She simply looked at him with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall in the dark. "Mr. Yoon," she said, her voice terrifyingly steady, "your thumb is blocking the slide of your sidearm. If you try to fire that weapon in this state of agitation, it will jam. Also, your grip is too high. The recoil will take the skin off your hand." Sung Hyun froze. The sheer clinical coldness of her tone acted like a bucket of ice water. He looked down at his weapon, then back at the woman he had trusted with his child's life for over a year. He slowly released her, his chest heaving. "Talk. Fast. You're thinking like a mob boss, looking for a traitor in your ranks," Antonio said, smoothing her blouse with a hand that didn't have the slightest tremor. "That's a waste of time. These weren't local street soldiers. They used a textbook, L-shaped ambush with synchronized flash suppression. These are professionals, mercenaries from the Black Pillar Group, most likely. They didn't take her for ransom. They took her for leverage in the port negotiations." She leaned forward, her gaze boring into his. "You've already sent your men to the docks. That was your first mistake. That's exactly where they expect you to go. They'll be waiting there to pick your men off one by one." "Then where is she?" Sung Hyun demanded, the authority in his voice wavering for the first time. "They're at the old cold storage facility in District 4, Antonio replied. "It's the only place with an underground loading bay that can bypass the city's thermal scanners. If we leave now, we can beat their extraction team." Sung Hyun stared at her, caught between the urge to kill her for her secrets and the realization that she was the only one who could navigate this nightmare. "How do you know their protocol?" "Because I wrote half of it," Antonio said, her voice dropping to a whisper that chilled the air. "Now stop talking and tell your driver to take the service tunnel. We're losing the girl's window." The car veered away from the chaotic street, tires splashing through deep puddles as Antonio directed the driver toward a nondescript self-storage facility on the edge of the industrial zone. Sung Hyun watched her in the dim light of the cabin, his gaze heavy with a mixture of suspicion and a newfound, unsettling respect. "You wrote the protocol," he repeated, the words tasting like ash. "You weren't just a soldier. You were an architect." Antonio didn't look at him. She was focused on the keypad at the facility's gate. "I was a ghost, Mr. Yoon, and ghosts don't have names. They have functions." They stopped in front of Unit 412. Antonio stepped out into the rain, her movements efficient and devoid of the nanny softness she had worn for months. She keyed in a complex 18-digit code. The metal door rolled up with a rusted groan, revealing what appeared to be a graveyard of old furniture and cardboard boxes. Antonio didn't hesitate. She walked to the back, shifted a heavy wooden wardrobe with surprising strength, and pressed a sequence of hidden panels in the floor. A hydraulic hiss cut through the sound of the storm as a section of the concrete floor retracted, revealing a stainless steel locker. Sung Hyun stepped forward, his eyes widening. Inside was a masterclass in lethal preparation. It wasn't just guns. It was a curated collection of high-end tactical gear. Encrypted tablets, signal jammers, medical-grade stimulants, and a row of specialized firearms maintained with clinical perfection. "You've been living in my house for a year," Sung Hyun whispered, his hand hovering over a customized sniper rifle. "You could have ended me at any breakfast table. Why are you doing this now?" Antonio pulled a lightweight tactical vest over her soaked blouse, the black Kevlar contrasting sharply with a modest beige fabric. She checked the chamber of a sidearm, the metallic clack echoing in the small space. "Because they took the girl, and you aren't equipped to get her back from the people who have her." She reached into the back of the locker and pulled out a small, leather-bound case. Inside were various passports, each with her face, but a different name, a different life. She tossed one to Sung Hyun. It was a diplomatic pass for a country that no longer existed on most maps. "I left this life to find silence," she said, her voice dropping into a low, dangerous register as she began to apply dark tactical grease to her cheekbones, masking the cut on her forehead. "But if they want a war, I'll give them one they didn't train for. Take the incendiary rounds from the bottom shelf. We have 22 minutes before the facility goes into lockdown." As she strapped a combat knife to her thigh, the transformation was complete. The quiet Nanny was dead. In her place stood a woman who looked like she had been forged in the very fires of the underworld Sung Hyun thought he ruled. She looked at him, her gaze a cold, unwavering promise. "Let's go find your daughter." The black sedan didn't just drive, it hunted. Antonio was behind the wheel, her hands light but firm on the leather, her eyes scanning the urban grid not as a commuter, but as a predator tracking a scent. Beside her, Sung Hyun gripped the door handle, his knuckles white. He was a man used to leading armies, but in this claustrophobic cockpit, he was merely a passenger to a woman who navigated the city's concrete veins with terrifying intimacy. "They've switched to a secondary frequency," Antonio said, her voice a calm hum over the roar of the engine. She reached out and toggled a series of switches on a modified radio unit she had pulled from her cache. "They're moving through the service tunnels beneath the west side. They think the interference will mask their signal." She slammed the gear shift into sport mode and floored it. The car fishtailed briefly on the rain-slicked asphalt before the tires found purchase, catapulting them into a narrow alleyway. They emerged onto a service road, the neon lights of the city blurring into long, jagged streaks of electric blue and blood red. "There," she pointed. A nondescript gray van was weaving through the light midnight traffic 3 blocks ahead. It didn't have plates, and its windows were tinted to a heavy, midnight black. "Ram them," Sung Hyun growled, his hand moving toward his holstered weapon. "No," Antonio countered, her tone sharp as a blade. "We ram them, we risk the girl. We need to disable the electronics first." She leaned forward, her gaze intensifying as she closed the gap. With a precision that made Sung Hyun's breath hitch, she brought their sedan alongside the van's rear quarter panel. She wasn't looking for a collision. She was looking for an opening. She reached into the center console and retrieved a compact, handheld EMP pulse emitter. "Hold the wheel," she commanded. Sung Hyun obeyed instinctively. Antonio leaned out the driver's side window, the freezing rain lashing her face and matting her hair to her skin. She aimed the device at the van's rear axle and triggered it. A faint, blue shimmer rippled through the air, and instantly the van's taillights flickered and died. The vehicle began to shudder, its engine choking as the onboard computer fried. The van swerved, the driver fighting to maintain control as the power steering vanished. It skidded across 3 lanes of traffic, sparks showering the pavement like dying stars, before slamming into a row of industrial dumpsters. Antonio didn't wait for the car to fully stop. She was out the door before the sedan had finished its skid, her sidearm raised in a professional high-ready stance. The Nanny was gone, replaced by a silhouette of lethal intent. "Cover the left," she barked at the Mafia boss. "If anyone breathes toward that back door, take the shot." As they closed in on the smoking wreckage, The air smelled of burnt rubber and ozone. The side door of the van creaked open, and the first of the masked men stumbled out, dazed but reaching for his rifle. He never got the chance to level it. Antonio's first shot was a low-velocity round to the shoulder, enough to drop him, not enough to kill. She needed information, and she needed it now. The warehouse smelled of stagnant river water and industrial grease. It was a cavernous, hollow shell of a building that felt more like a tomb than a hiding place. Antonio moved through the shadows with a predatory silence, her tactical boots barely making a sound on the cracked concrete. Beside her, Sung-hyun was a different kind of presence. Heavy, loud with suppressed rage, his weapon gripped tight enough to fracture the frame. Thermal signature, 10 o'clock, Antonio whispered, her voice barely a vibration. They crested a stack of rusted shipping crates and looked down. In the center of a makeshift ring of halogen lights sat Day-Sik. She was huddled in a metal chair, her white dress a jarring beacon of purity against the filth. She wasn't tied, but she was frozen, her wide eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the light. Day-Sik, Sung-hyun's voice broke the silence, his fatherly instinct overriding his training. He moved to surge forward, but Antonio's hand shot out, catching his shoulder with the strength of an iron vise. Wait, look at the shadows, Mr. Yoon. The angles are too clean. It's a kill box. Before she could pull him back, the halogen lights flared into a blinding, white intensity. From the high catwalks above, red laser dots bloomed across the floor, dancing towards Sung-hyun's chest. Down! Antonio roared. She tackled the Mafia boss just as the first volley of gunfire chewed the concrete where they had been standing. The silence of the warehouse was shattered by the rhythmic, deafening roar of automatic weapons. Antonio didn't panic. She worked. She rolled into a crouch, pulling a smoke canister from her belt and snapping the pin with her teeth. The gray-white cloud erupted, masking their position, but the gunmen on the catwalks began blind firing into the mist. Antonio could hear Day-Sik's terrified screams, a sound that cut through her clinical detachment like a hot blade. They aren't hitting the girl, Antonio shouted over the thunder of the rifles. They need her alive for the leverage. They only want us. Stay behind the crates and suppress the north line. I'm going for her. You'll be exposed. Sung-hyun yelled, returning fire with his handgun, the muzzle flashes illuminating his desperate face. I've been exposed my whole life, Antonio replied. She moved before he could argue. She didn't run. She navigated the crossfire with a terrifying, rhythmic cadence, timing her sprints to the bursts of the shooters above. She was a blur of black Kevlar and lethal intent. When an operative stepped from behind a pillar to intercept her, she didn't slow down. She slid beneath his line of sight, her knife finding the gap in his armor with surgical precision, before rising in a single motion to snatch Day-Sik from the chair. She pulled the girl into the hollow of her chest, shielding her small body with her own armored back. Bullets sparked off the metal chair she had just vacated. Close your eyes, little bird, Antonio whispered into the girl's hair. The nanny's got you. Now they were pinned, Antonio and the child in the center, Sung-hyun 50 feet away, and a dozen professionals closing the circle. For the first time, Antonio felt the cold weight of the stakes. This wasn't just a mission anymore. It was a family being hunted in the dark. The shadows of the warehouse seemed to bleed into Antonio's vision, narrowing the world down to the tactical reality of survival. She tucked Day-Sik behind a heavy industrial generator, the metal casing vibrating as bullets shredded the air above them. Stay small, little bird. Don't look at the light. A flashbang detonated 10 feet away, a white-hot scream of light that would have blinded a normal person. But Antonio had lived in the flash. She didn't flinch. As two operatives rushed the generator, thinking they had the advantage, she rose from the smoke like a vengeful spirit. The mask of the nanny didn't just slip, it disintegrated. The first man was large, a wall of tactical nylon and aggression. Antonio didn't use the gun. She used the space between his breaths. She stepped inside his guard, her hand striking like a piston into his throat. As he gagged, she grabbed his head, her thumbs finding the pressure points behind his ears with a terrifying, intimate knowledge of the human nervous system. With a sharp, clinical twist, she sent him to the floor, his nervous system short-circuiting before he even felt the impact. The second operative leveled a combat knife. Antonio met him halfway. She moved with a speed that felt wrong, a blurred sequence of parries and strikes that bypassed his training entirely. She caught his knife hand, the bone snapping under her palm with a dry, wooden crack. She didn't stop there. The restraint that had governed her life for 14 months, the performative dullness, the soft smiles, was gone. In its place was a cold, efficient monster. She drove her elbow into his temple, then followed with a flurry of strikes to his vitals, each hit calculated to do the maximum amount of damage with a minimum amount of movement. By the time he hit the ground, he wasn't just defeated, he was broken. Sung Hyun watched from the crates, his weapon lowering as he stared at the woman he thought he knew. The cut on her forehead had reopened, a single line of crimson running down the center of her face like a mark of Cain. She stood over the fallen men, her chest barely heaving, her eyes devoid of empathy or fear. She wasn't a nanny. She wasn't even a soldier. She was an apex predator who had been forced out of retirement. Antonio, Sung Hyun called out, his voice hesitant. She turned her head slowly. The blue and red light from the police sirens outside filtered through the high windows, illuminating the blood on her brow and the terrifying stillness in her gaze. She looked at him, and for the first time, the Mafia boss felt a genuine shiver of dread. He realized then that he hadn't hired a servant to watch his daughter. He had invited a ghost into his home, and the ghost was finally hungry. The extraction team's black sedan was a shadow against the iron girders of the Skyway Bridge. The rain had turned into a fine, stinging mist that caught the red glow of the bridge's warning lights. At the center of the span, the kidnappers held their ground, their weapons trained on the lone figure walking toward them. Kim Antonio didn't bring an army. She didn't even bring Sung Hyun, whom she had ordered to stay in the shadows of the toll plaza. She walked with a measured, rhythmic pace, her hands raised and empty. In the distance, the sirens of the city felt like a different world. Here, there was only the wind and the metallic tang of the river below. The lead kidnapper, a man whose face was hidden by a tactical mask, stepped forward, his hand gripping Day-6's shoulder. The girl's white dress was stained with oil and rain, her eyes wide with a terror that had long since surpassed tears. The drive, the man rasped, his voice distorted by a comms unit. Give us the encrypted coordinates, and the girl lives. Antonio stopped 10 feet away. The blood on her forehead had dried into a dark, jagged line. She looked not at the men, but at Day-6. I don't have a drive, she said, her voice carrying over the wind with a terrifying, flat calm. And you're not going to kill her, because you're not mercenaries. You're freelancers, and freelancers don't get paid for corpses. The man shifted his weight, his finger tightening on the trigger of his submachine gun. You're stalling. You have 3 seconds before I drop her over the rail. I'm not stalling, Antonio said. I'm counting. In one fluid motion, she didn't reach for a gun. She reached for the bridge's suspension cable. With a strength that seemed impossible, she kicked a hidden release valve she had rigged only minutes before, a bypass to the bridge's pneumatic maintenance system. A high-pitched hiss cut through the air as a cloud of pressurized steam erupted from the walkway, blinding the kidnappers. In the chaos, Antonio didn't run for the girl. She ran for the lead man, but she didn't strike him. Instead, she threw a heavy, metallic object into the river. The coordinates, the man screamed, his greed overriding his tactical training. He lunged toward the railing, his eyes instinctively following the splash in the dark water below. That split second was all the monster needed. Antonio didn't use a weapon. She used her own body as a projectile, slamming into the man with enough force to send him over the edge. As he fell, she snatched Day 6's hand, pulling her back from the precipice. But she didn't stop there. She turned to the remaining operatives, her eyes glowing with a lethal, predatory light. "The drive I threw was a decoy," she whispered into the sudden silence of steam. "I'm the only map you'll ever find, and you've just lost your leverage." She stood between the men and the child, a silhouette of black Kevlar and absolute iron, waiting for them to make the mistake of moving. She had gambled on their greed, and she had won. Now, there was only the cleanup. The Skyway Bridge was silent once more, save for the rhythmic pulse of the emergency lights and the distant, mournful low of a foghorn. The remaining kidnappers had vanished into the mist, realizing that chasing a ghost was a quick way to become one. Dasik was asleep in the back of the armored sedan, her small head resting against the very tactical vest Antonio had used to shield her. She was safe, swaddled in the scent of gunpowder and the familiar, grounding presence of the woman who had saved her. Yoon Sung-hyun stood by the railing, the wind whipping his damp hair. He looked at the bridge, then at the river, and finally at the woman standing beside him. Antonio was cleaning the blood from her forehead with a piece of gauze, her movements once again economical and precise. The monster had retreated behind the veil of professional discipline, but the air around her still hummed with a lethality that couldn't be ignored. "You knew exactly how they would react," Sung-hyun said, his voice stripped of its usual bravado. "You played them like a symphony." "Greed is the most predictable variable in human nature, Mr. Yoon," Antonio replied. She didn't look like a nanny anymore, even in her soaked beige blouse. She looked like a general surveying a battlefield. Sung-hyun reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out a folder. It was the employment contract Antonio had signed 14 months ago, a document detailing nap schedules, dietary restrictions, and holiday pay. He looked at it for a long second, then pulled a silver lighter from his pocket. The flame flickered in the wind before catching the paper. He watched it curl into black ash, letting the wind carry the remnants over the edge of the bridge. "The nanny is dead," Sung-hyun said, his eyes meeting hers with a depth of respect that bordered on awe. He reached back into his pocket and produced a single, heavy card embossed with the gold seal of the Dragon Syndicate. There were no words on it, only a microchip and a signature line. "I don't need someone to cut crusts off sandwiches anymore, Antonio. I need someone who can see the shadows before they move. I need a guardian of the Empire. Someone to stand at my right hand and ensure that what happened tonight never happens again." Antonio looked at the card, then at the sleeping girl in the car. She had spent a year trying to find peace in silence, but tonight had proven that for someone like her, peace was a lie. The only way to protect the innocence she had grown to love was to embrace the darkness she was built for. She took the card. Her fingers didn't tremble. "My rates have changed, Mr. Yoon," she said, a faint, razor-sharp smile touching her lips. "Whatever the cost," he replied. As the sun began to bleed a pale, watery gray over the Chicago skyline, the black sedan pulled away. Kim Antonio sat in the back, her hand resting protectively on Day 6's shoulder. She was no longer a ghost hiding in the beige. She was the shadow that would keep the monsters at bay. The contract was signed in blood, and the Empire finally had its queen.